Autumn rain pelted the windows of Riverside Veterinary Clinic as though nature itself sensed the revelation about to unfold within these sterile walls. Dr. Elena Martinez stood frozen over the examination table, her latex-gloved hands trembling. She stared at the open mouth of the creature before her, the one the Morrison family had lovingly called Shadow for the past week. Those teeth, dear God, those teeth. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice barely steady, "I need you to wait here. Don't leave, don't take him anywhere." Brian Morrison's stomach dropped. 7 days ago, his daughters had begged him to rescue what looked like a starving puppy near the park. 7 days of watching the unusual creature bond with his family. 7 days of Diana, his 12-year-old, falling deeply in love with an animal that Dr. Martinez's shaking hands told him was not what any of them believed. The veterinarian stepped into her office and grabbed her phone. Within the hour, her clinic would be swarming with zoo officials, wildlife experts, and federal agents. And the Morrison family's simple act of compassion would trigger a chain of events that would expose an international crime, test a young girl's understanding of love, and change the fate of one of the world's rarest creatures. This rescue would change everything they thought they knew about saving a life. The October sun hung low over Riverside Park, casting long shadows across the walking trail where the Morrison family completed their Sunday evening routine. Brian Morrison walked with the measured pace of a man who believed in schedules and structure, qualities that had served him well as a civil engineer, but sometimes clashed with the chaos of raising 2 daughters. Beside him, his wife Shirley pointed out the changing leaves to their youngest, Lizzie, whose 8-year-old imagination transformed every fallen acorn into buried treasure. Diana trailed behind, earbuds dangling around her neck, her attention divided between her phone and the world around her. At 12, she occupied that peculiar space between childhood wonder and teenage cynicism, though her passion for animals remained undimmed. She'd covered her bedroom walls with wildlife posters and spent hours watching veterinary procedure videos online, much to her parents' mixture of pride and concern. "Dad, look, there's a puppy!" Diana's voice cut through the evening air with such urgency that Brian's engineering mind immediately calculated distances and potential dangers before his eyes found what had captured his daughter's attention. Near the base of an old oak tree, partially hidden by fallen leaves, something moved. Brian approached cautiously, Shirley and Lizzie close behind. What he saw made him stop short. The creature was unlike any puppy he'd encountered in his 42 years. Emaciated to the point where every rib showed beneath dark, nearly hairless skin that wrinkled around its shoulders like oversized clothing. Enormous ears stood erect on a head that seemed too large for its frail body. When it lifted its face toward them, amber eyes, too bright, too aware, regarded them with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "That doesn't look like any puppy I've ever seen," Brian said slowly. Shirley knelt down, her elementary teacher's instinct to nurture overriding caution. She'd spent 20 years coaxing frightened children out of their shells. This trembling creature pulled at the same heartstrings. "It's starving, Brian. We can't just leave it." "Please, Dad." Diana was already moving closer, her phone forgotten. "He'll die out here. Look at him. He's barely breathing." Lizzie's lower lip trembled. "The monsters will get him when it gets dark." Brian exchanged a glance with Shirley. In that look passed years of partnership, of shared decisions about scraped knees and broken rules, about teaching moments and when to bend. This was one of those moments where practicality collided with compassion, and both knew which would win. "All right," he said, "but carefully, he might bite." The creature watched their approach with wary stillness, too weak to flee, too desperate to resist. When Diana's gentle hands touched its trembling frame, it whimpered, a sound so achingly vulnerable that even Brian felt his throat tighten. Remarkably, it didn't fight as they lifted it, docile despite what must have been terrible fear. Lizzie stripped off her favorite purple jacket without being asked, and they wrapped the creature carefully, feeling the rapid hammering of its heart against the fabric. In the laundry room, Diana held it in her lap, whispering reassurances, while Shirley drove faster than her usual cautious pace. The laundry room became an impromptu sanctuary. Old towels lined a cardboard box while Brian filled bowls with water and the leftover chicken from dinner. The creature's response to food was almost frightening in its intensity. It devoured everything, then looked up for more, those strange amber eyes tracking their every movement. "He needs a name," Lizzie announced with the certainty of childhood. "Shadow," she decided, watching the dark creature curl into itself, "because he's like a shadow, all dark and quiet." Diana was already on the floor beside the box, her hand resting gently on Shadow's side. "I'll take care of him," she said, and Brian heard in her voice the same determination she'd shown learning to ride a bike, solving impossible math problems, studying for her dreams. "I promise I'll take care of him." Later, after Lizzie was in bed, Brian and Shirley stood in the kitchen doorway, watching their older daughter through the laundry room's open door. Diana had pulled a sleeping bag onto the floor, her hand never leaving Shadow's makeshift bed. "That's not a normal dog," Brian whispered. Shirley nodded slowly. "I know, but we can give him a few days to recover, get him strong enough to a vet visit. Then we'll know what we're dealing with." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that something about Shadow's proportions, his coloring, the shape of his skull didn't match any breed either of them recognized. But as they watched Diana finally drift to sleep, her young face peaceful beside the creature she'd already claimed, they chose to let that worry wait for tomorrow. Outside, October wind whispered through bare branches, carrying with it the first breath of winter. And in a warm laundry room, a girl dreamed of saving lives, while beside her, one of the world's rarest creatures dreamed whatever wild things dream when they find themselves impossibly far from home. The first 3 days with Shadow passed in a blur of discovery and growing unease. The creature they'd rescued gained weight with remarkable speed, his gaunt frame filling out as he devoured bowl after bowl of food, though never the kibble Diana had optimistically purchased. He preferred the raw chicken Shirley reluctantly provided, tearing at it with a ferocity that seemed more primal than any family pet should possess. Diana documented everything in a spiral notebook she'd labeled Shadow's Recovery Journal, sketching his disproportionately large ears that stood perpetually erect, measuring his legs that seemed to grow longer each day, photographing the dark skin that stubbornly refused to sprout the fuzzy puppy coat she'd expected. Her online searches grew increasingly frantic: mixed breed with huge ears, hairless puppy breeds, unusual dog proportions, but nothing quite matched what paced that laundry room. Because Shadow did pace, endlessly. His amber eyes tracked the perimeter of every room they allowed him into, his lean body following invisible boundaries that only he could sense. He ignored the tennis ball Diana rolled hopefully across the floor, showed no interest in the rope toy Lizzie dangled before him, and regarded the squeaky plush rabbit with something approaching disdain. "Should a puppy act this way?" Shirley asked on the third morning, watching Shadow trace the fence line of their backyard with mechanical precision. He didn't run or play or dig like their neighbor's golden retriever. He simply walked the boundary, paused at corners, lifted his long snout to test the air, then continued his patrol. Brian lowered his coffee mug, his engineer's mind struggling to reconcile data that didn't fit expected patterns. Every dog is different. He's probably traumatized from being abandoned. "He's perfect," Diana said, with the fierce defensiveness of someone protecting what they love. "He's just special." But even Diana couldn't explain Shadow's vocalizations. Not the friendly barks or playful yips of normal puppies, but high-pitched calls that echoed strangely in their suburban neighborhood. Sounds that made Mrs. Chen from next door peer over the fence with undisguised suspicion. "That's the strangest looking dog I've ever seen," their neighbor commented, her disapproval evident. "Are you sure he's sick?" Diana stormed inside, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. That night, she'd written in her diary with shaking hands, "Shadow is the best thing that's ever happened to me. Why can't people see how special he is? He looks at me like he understands everything I say. I love him so much." Lizzie had better luck with training. Shadow learned to sit on command with surprising speed. but something in his posture suggested confusion rather than obedience, as though he was humoring them rather than truly understanding why humans wanted him in that particular position. The night howling started on day 4, not the mournful baying of hound dogs or the territorial warnings of guard breeds, but something else entirely, a series of high-pitched yips that built into an eerie ululation that carried across the sleeping neighborhood. Brian found Diana in the laundry room at 2 in the morning, her arms wrapped around Shadow's trembling frame. "He has nightmares," she whispered, "just like I do sometimes. He needs me, Dad." By Thursday morning, Shirley had made the decision. "I'm calling Dr. Martinez," she announced over breakfast. "Not because anything's wrong," she added quickly, seeing Diana's face pale, "but because we need to make sure Shadow's healthy. That's what responsible pet owners do." The appointment was scheduled that afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Diana slipped her fingers through Shadow's carrier grate, touching his dark skin one more time. "I won't let anything happen to you, I promise." Promises made with whole hearts by those too young to understand that some promises can't be kept. Riverside Veterinary Clinic smelled of antiseptic and pet shampoo, a combination that did nothing to settle Brian's nerves as he carried Shadow's carrier through the glass doors. He'd taken a personal day from work, telling his supervisor it was a family matter, which was true, though he couldn't have explained why his gut twisted with apprehension over a simple puppy checkup. The waiting room fell silent when he set the carrier down. A woman with a Persian cat actually gasped. A man with a Labrador retriever leaned forward, squinting at Shadow through the grate, then caught Brian's eye and quickly looked away. Even the veterinary assistant did a double take when calling them back. Dr. Elena Martinez had the weathered competence of someone who'd spent 20 years diagnosing everything from ear mites to cancer. She moved with efficient grace, her dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. But when Shadow emerged from the carrier, something flickered across her professional mask. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition of something she couldn't quite place. "Interesting," she murmured, which Brian's engineering mind translated as concerning. The examination proceeded methodically. Weight, 12 pounds, up from the estimated 8 when they'd found him. Temperature, slightly elevated but within acceptable range. Heart rate, faster than typical, but stress could account for that. "He's malnourished but recovering well," Dr. Martinez said, her hands gentle as they moved across Shadow's frame. "How long have you had him?" Brian explained the rescue, watching the veterinarian's face for clues to her thoughts. She nodded along, asking questions about appetite, behavior, vocalizations. Her expression remained professionally neutral until she examined Shadow's ears. "These are remarkably large," she said, measuring them with calipers. "And the placement—" She trailed off, making notes. She moved to Shadow's legs, extending them carefully, feeling the joints and bone structure. "Unusual proportions for a puppy. The leg-to-body ratio is—" Again, she stopped mid-sentence, writing something in her chart that Brian couldn't see from his angle. "Let me look at his teeth," Dr. Martinez said, and something in her tone made Brian's stomach drop before he understood why. Shadow opened his mouth docilely, as though sensing the importance of this moment. Dr. Martinez leaned in, her penlight illuminating the interior of Shadow's jaw, and the color drained from her face so completely that Brian stood up, alarm bells ringing in his head. The teeth that gleamed in that clinical light were sharp and triangular, designed for tearing rather than grinding. The carnassial teeth, Brian didn't know the term then, but he'd learn it soon enough, were structured unlike anything found in domestic dog breeds. They were the teeth of something wild, something that had evolved to hunt and kill with brutal efficiency. "Mr. Morrison," Dr. Martinez said, her voice carefully controlled in the way that precedes very bad news. "I need you to wait here. Don't leave. Don't take him anywhere." "What's wrong? Is he sick?" "Please, just wait." She left the room with Shadow's chart, and through the door's small window, Brian watched her pull out her cell phone with shaking hands. 20 minutes crawled by. Brian texted Shirley, "Something weird is happening." Shadow sat calmly on the examination table, those amber eyes watching Brian with an unsettling intelligence, as though he understood exactly what was unfolding and had simply been waiting for the humans to catch up. When Dr. Martinez returned, she carried a veterinary anatomy notebook open to pages Brian couldn't quite see. Her professional composure had returned, but her eyes held something new, excitement mixed with what might have been fear. "Mr. Morrison, I've called some colleagues who need to see Shadow immediately. I don't think he's a domestic dog. His dental structure, skeletal proportions, the vocalizations you described, they don't match any known dog breed." Brian's laugh came out hollow. "What do you mean? He's obviously a dog." Dr. Martinez met his eyes steadily. "Mr. Morrison, I believe what you've rescued is a wild animal, and if I'm right, he's one of the rarest creatures on Earth." The parking lot of Riverside Veterinary Clinic transformed over the next 90 minutes into something resembling a crime scene. Brian watched through the waiting room window as vehicles arrived in succession. A white van marked with the regional zoo logo, a dark SUV with government plates, a silver sedan that disgorged a woman carrying equipment cases that looked more suited to a forensics lab than a veterinary clinic. Dr. Martinez had moved them to the largest examination room, where Shadow sat on the steel table with that same uncanny calm, as though he'd been expecting this all along. Brian's hands trembled as he texted updates to Shirley, each message more surreal than the last. Dr. James Chen entered first, and the room seems to shrink around his presence. At 55, the director of wildlife conservation carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that mattered. His salt and pepper hair was immaculately groomed, his eyes kind behind rimless glasses, but his jaw was set with professional determination. Behind him came Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, and Brian felt the air shift with her arrival. She was younger, late 30s perhaps, with close-cropped natural hair and eyes that burned with barely contained intensity. She moved like someone who'd spent years in the field rather than behind a desk, her movements economical and purposeful. When her gaze landed on Shadow, her sharp intake of breath was audible. Agent Marcus Torres brought up the rear, his federal credentials already visible on his belt. Everything about him screamed law enforcement. The rigid posture, the assessing eyes, the way his hand rested near his hip, and a gesture Brian recognized from too many crime dramas. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Dr. Okonkwo," the wildlife biologist said, her Nigerian-American accent lending music to her words. "I need to examine your animal. May I?" Brian could only nod, his voice lost somewhere between confusion and mounting dread. Dr. Okonkwo approached Shadow with the careful precision of someone who understood wild things. She didn't reach out immediately, instead letting the creature scent her hand, observing his reactions with clinical focus. When she finally touched him, her hands moved with practiced expertise, checking dentition, palpating bone structure, examining paw pods with an intensity that made Dr. Martinez's earlier assessment seem cursory. "Vocalize for me," Dr. Okonkwo murmured, and somehow, impossibly, Shadow responded. The high-pitched yips that had confused the Morrisons for days filled the examination room, and Dr. Okonkwo recorded every sound on her phone, her free hand making rapid notes. She produced calipers and began measuring Shadow's skull with mathematical precision, the distance between eye sockets, the angle of the jaw, the proportions of the cranium. Each measurement was photographed, documented, cross-referenced against data Brian couldn't see on her tablet. Dr. Chen joined her, and they conferred in whispered Latin terms that meant nothing to Brian, but clearly meant everything to them. He caught fragments: carnassial teeth development, metacarpal ratios, Highland adaptation markers. "Can someone please tell me what's happening?" Brian's voice came out louder than intended, edged with panic he could no longer contain. Dr. Okonkwo turned to face him, and in her expression, Brian saw gravity and excitement warring for dominance. "Mr. Morrison, what you've been caring for is not a domestic dog." She paused as though weighing how to deliver news that would change everything. "This is Canis simonensis, an Ethiopian wolf pup." The words hung in the air like an impossible equation. A wolf? That's impossible. We found him in Riverside Park. He's just a puppy. Dr. Chen stepped forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Ethiopian wolves are the world's rarest canid, Mr. Morrison. Fewer than 500 exist in the wild, all of them in the Ethiopian highlands of East Africa. They're critically endangered. They shouldn't exist anywhere near California, which means someone brought this pup here illegally." Agent Torres moved into Brian's line of sight, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. "Mr. Morrison, I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Possessing an endangered species without proper permits is a federal offense. I need to ask you some questions." Brian's world tilted. "I didn't know. We were just trying to help. My daughters found him starving in the park. We thought we were saving a dog." "We understand that," Dr. Okonkwo said quickly, her hand raised in reassurance. "But we need to know exactly where and when you found him. Every detail matters." Brian recounted the story. Sunday evening, the path near the old oak, Shadow's condition, the week of recovery. Each word felt like evidence against him, as though compassion had somehow become criminal. "This pup shouldn't be anywhere near here," Dr. Chen said grimly. "Someone stole him from a breeding program or smuggled him from Africa. Either way, his presence here is the result of serious wildlife trafficking." Through the examination room's window, Brian could see more vehicles arriving, official-looking people with clipboards and cameras. His phone buzzed with Shirley's increasingly worried texts. And on the steel table, Shadow, Tesfa, he'd later learn, meaning hope in Amharic, watched Brian with those ancient amber eyes, a creature impossibly far from home, carrying in his fragile frame the weight of his species' survival. Brian's simple act of rescue had just become an international incident. Brian's car pulled into the driveway just as twilight settled over their suburban street, but he sat motionless behind the wheel for a full minute before cutting the engine. Through the living room window, he could see 3 silhouettes waiting: Shirley pacing, Diana perched on the edge of the couch, Lizzie's small form pressed against the glass. They'd been texting him all afternoon, increasingly frantic questions he couldn't answer while federal agents documented every detail of their rescue. The front door opened before he reached it. 3 faces, 3 different expressions of hope that he was about to shatter. "Where's Shadow?" Diana asked immediately, already moving past him toward the empty car. "He's still at the clinic," Brian said, and the words felt like stones in his mouth. "We need to talk. All of us." They gathered in the living room, that familiar space now feeling like foreign territory. Brian searched for the right words, the engineer in him wanting to present facts logically, the father in him wanting to cushion the blow he was about to deliver. "Shadow isn't a dog," he said finally, and watched incomprehension bloom across his daughters' faces. The explanation came in fragments. Ethiopian wolf, critically endangered, fewer than 500 left in the world, illegal possession, federal investigation. Each word landed like a physical blow. Shirley's hand rose to her mouth. Lizzie's eyes filled with tears she didn't yet understand, and Diana's face transformed from confusion to something harder, something that looked terrifyingly like betrayal. "I don't care what he is," Diana's voice cracked with emotion. "He's ours. We saved him." "How did an African wolf end up in our park?" Shirley asked, her teacher's mind trying to solve an impossible equation. Lizzie's question was simpler, devastating in its innocence. "But we saved him. Why can't we keep him?" The doorbell interrupted whatever Brian might have attempted. Agent Torres stood on their porch, Dr. Okonkwo beside him, both wearing professional sympathy that did nothing to soften what they represented, the machinery of law and conservation that was about to dismantle Diana's heart. The formal interview proceeded with methodical efficiency. Torres documented every detail of the rescue while Dr. Okonkwo took notes, occasionally asking clarification questions in her gentle accent. Diana sat rigid on the couch, arms crossed, radiating hostility toward these strangers who'd invaded her home to take away what she loved. What you need to understand is that Shadow, the pup you rescued, is likely a victim of wildlife trafficking. We see these cases more often than you'd think. He explained the underground market for exotic animals, the breeding programs infiltrated by criminals, the networks that moved endangered species like contraband across international borders. Rare animals stolen or smuggled, sold to collectors willing to pay enormous sums for the privilege of owning something wild. When these animals get sick or prove too difficult to handle, the traffickers panic. They can't take them to regular vets without raising questions, so they abandon them, dump them somewhere public, and disappear. So people stole him? Diana's voice was ice. Hurt him? And now you're taking him from us? We're the only ones who helped him. I understand this is difficult, Torres said, and something in his tone suggested he'd delivered this speech before to other families whose compassion had collided with impossible circumstances. Dr. Okonkwo leaned forward, her passion for her work evident in every word. Shadow needs specialized care that you simply cannot provide. Ethiopian wolves have specific dietary requirements. They eat primarily rodents in their natural habitat. They need social structures, other wolves, space to express natural behaviors. He's not meant to live as a pet, no matter how much love you give him. What happens to him now? Shirley asked, one arm around Lizzie, who'd begun crying softly. He needs a full evaluation at our zoo facility. We'll assess his health, his ability to integrate into our conservation program. If he's strong enough, healthy enough, he could eventually return to Ethiopia, join the breeding program there. His genetics might be crucial for species survival. You're sending him away? Diana stood up abruptly, her voice rising. To Africa? We'll never see him again? Brian reached for his daughter, but she jerked away. Diana, we have to think about what's best for... We love him. Isn't that enough? Tears streamed down Diana's face now, 12 years of certainty crumbling. Why doesn't that matter? Sometimes love means doing what's best for someone, not what we want, Brian said quietly, though the words felt inadequate against his daughter's grief. You don't understand, Diana's voice broke completely. He needs me. I promised him I'd take care of him. She ran from the room, her footsteps thundering up the stairs, followed by the slam of her bedroom door and the click of the lock engaging. In the sudden silence, Lizzie's quiet sobs seemed impossibly loud. I miss Shadow, Lizzie whispered against her mother's shoulder. Agent Torres and Dr. Okonkwo exchanged glances heavy with shared experience. They'd seen this before, would see it again, families torn apart by the collision of good intentions and immutable reality. After they left, taking with them folders full of documentation and promises of updates, the Morrison house settled into a grief-stricken quiet. Upstairs, Diana's music played too loud, a barrier against conversation. Downstairs, Brian and Shirley sat on the couch, Lizzie between them, all three staring at the empty space where Shadow's carrier had stood just days ago. Did we do the right thing? Shirley asked. Brian had no answer. Outside, October wind scattered leaves across their lawn, and somewhere in a sterile clinic, one of the world's rarest creatures curled in a temporary cage, impossibly far from the highlands that should have been his birthright, caught between the family that loved him and the wilds that claimed him. The next 48 hours transformed the Morrison home into an unexpected hub of federal investigation. Agent Torres returned Saturday morning with a laptop full of evidence and a story that made their simple rescue infinitely more complex. We've identified where your pup came from, Torres said, settling at their dining room table while Brian made coffee no one would drink. 6 weeks ago, a juvenile Ethiopian wolf was stolen from the captive breeding program at Denver Zoo. Security footage shows a staff member, someone with authorized access, taking him after hours. He turns the laptop screen to show grainy footage of a figure in zoo uniform carrying a small crate toward a service entrance. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m. The staff member, Daniel Kowalski, had been working with an international trafficking ring for at least 2 years. They specialize in exotic, endangered species. The rarer, the more valuable. Shirley's hand trembled as she set down her mug. How much was he worth? On the black market, upwards of $200,000 to the right collector. Torres pulled up another file. But this particular pup, his real name is Tesfa. It means hope in Amharic. He was specifically targeted. His genetic markers are crucial for species diversity in the breeding program. Losing him was catastrophic for conservation efforts. Diana had been listening from the stairs, hidden but present. At the mention of Tesfa's name, Brian saw her lean forward slightly, her resistance beginning its slow crack. The trafficking network operates across 3 states, Torres said, spreading printouts across the table. They move animals through a series of handlers, always staying ahead of authorities. When Tesfa became sick, stress-induced illness from the trauma of capture and transport, they panicked. Sick animals draw attention, require veterinary care they couldn't risk providing, so they dumped him. "In our park," Shirley whispered. "They just left him to die?" "Your family's rescue may have saved this animal's life," Torres said, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine gratitude. "And your report is helping us break up this entire operation. We have raids planned for Monday across multiple locations. Your cooperation has been crucial." After Torres left with promises of updates, the house fell into contemplative silence. Diana emerged from her self-imposed isolation that evening to find her parents at the computer, deep in research. Brian had pulled up article after article about Ethiopian wolves, their native highlands 3,000 to 4,000 meters above sea level, their specialized diet of giant mole rats and other rodents, their complex family pack structures that rivaled wolf societies anywhere on Earth. "They're critically endangered," Shirley read aloud, perhaps for Diana's benefit. "Habitat loss, disease transmitted from domestic dogs, human conflict, every individual matters to the species' survival." Diana stood in the doorway, her face puffy from crying, her voice small. "He's not just any animal, is he? He's important to the whole world." Shirley turned, saw her daughter's fragile understanding beginning to take shape. "He is, sweetheart, and that's why—" "But what if he's lonely?" Diana's voice croaked. "What if he misses us? What if we were his family and now he has no one?" The question hung unanswered until Shirley's phone rang. Dr. Okonkwo's video call request flashed on the screen. "Diana," the wildlife biologist said gently when they connected, "I thought you might want to see where Tesfa will be going. Would that help?" What followed was a virtual tour that gradually shifted something fundamental in Diana's perspective. Dr. Okonkwo walked them through the specialized facility, vast enclosures designed to mimic Ethiopian highland habitat, complete with native vegetation and carefully controlled climate. She showed them the veterinary center, the nutrition program with its carefully balanced rodent-based diet, the enrichment protocols designed to encourage natural behaviors. Then she turned the camera to another enclosure and Diana gasped. 3 Ethiopian wolf pups played there, their dark coats and amber eyes and oversized ears marking them unmistakably as Tesfa's kind. They wrestled and vocalized and moved with the same peculiar grace Shadow had displayed in their backyard, except here it didn't look peculiar at all. Here it looked right. "They look like—" Diana stopped herself, swallowed hard. "They look like Tesfa." It was the first time she'd used his real name, and Shirley reached for Brian's hand, both of them recognizing the significance of that small surrender. "These pups lost their parents to disease in Ethiopia," Dr. Okonkwo explained. "They're part of our breeding program, but they also provide social structure for rescued wolves like Tesfa. He won't be alone, Diana. He'll be with his own kind, learning to be what he was meant to be." Diana watched the screen for a long time after the call ended, her expression unreadable. Lizzie had fallen asleep against Shirley's shoulder, exhausted by days of emotional turmoil. Brian started to speak, but Diana held her hand. "I need to think," she said quietly, "about what's best for him, not what I want, what he needs." She climbed the stairs slowly, and this time she left her bedroom door open. Through it, their parents could see her at her desk, writing in her journal with fierce concentration, processing grief the only way she knew how, by trying to understand it, to make sense of impossible choices and the gap between loving something and being what it needs. Outside, autumn stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human heartbreak, and in a climate-controlled facility across town, Tesfa slept his first truly restful sleep since being stolen from Denver, his body finally beginning to heal from the trauma of his impossible journey to this impossible place where a family's compassion had saved him, even as love would require letting him go. 1 week after their world shifted, the Morrison family drove to the regional zoo's conservation facility in silence, punctuated only by Lizzie's nervous humming. Diana sat in the back seat, her journal open on her lap to an entry she'd written at 3 in the morning. I love Shadow, Tesfa, so much it hurts. But maybe that's what real love is supposed to feel like. Not the easy kind that makes you happy, but the hard kind that makes you better. She'd been quiet all week, moving through school and meals and bedtime routines like a ghost of herself. Shirley had found her crying in the laundry room twice, curled in the space where Tesfa's bed had been. But something had shifted too, a resignation that looked less like defeat and more like painful growth. Dr. Okonkwo met them at the facility's entrance, her warm smile a sharp contrast to the institutional gray of the building. He's doing remarkably well, she said as she led them through security checkpoints and climate-controlled corridors. You'll see a significant change. The special visitation area was separated by floor-to-ceiling glass designed for wildlife observation. On the other side, in an enclosure that mimicked highland terrain with artificial rocks and native grasses, Tesfa explored with visible curiosity. He'd gained weight, his ribs no longer prominent beneath dark skin that now looked healthy rather than emaciated. His movements were more confident, more purposeful. The moment he saw them, everything changed. His ears shot forward, his amber eyes locked onto Diana with laser focus, and he bounded toward the glass with vocalizations that made Shirley's breath catch. Sounds of recognition, of joy, of connection that transcended species. He remembers us, Diana whispered, her hand pressed against the glass. Tesfa pressed his paw against the same spot from his side, separated by barrier but united by something neither science nor law could quantify. Of course he does, Dr. Okonkwo said gently. You saved his life. She explained his progress with evident pride, thriving on his proper diet of rodent prey, natural hunting behaviors beginning to emerge, social responses improving. He's strong enough now to join our full conservation program. We'll be transferring him to our specialized facility in Oregon next month. It's one of the best Ethiopian wolf conservation centers in North America. And then, Brian asked, though he already knew the answer would hurt. Eventually, if his health and socialization continue positively, he'll be considered for the breeding program in Ethiopia, returned to his homeland to help save his species. Lizzie began crying softly, and Shirley gathered her close, but Diana remained still, her gaze never leaving Tesfa. Can I have some time alone with him? Diana asked, her voice barely audible. The adults exchanged glances, then quietly retreated to the observation area's far end, giving her space while maintaining visual supervision. Diana sank to the floor, cross-legged against the glass. After a moment, Tesfa settled on his side too, as though they'd rehearsed this choreography. I thought I knew what was best for you. I thought keeping you with me was love. I thought if I loved you enough, that would be enough. Her voice cracked, but she continued. But real love is wanting you to be happy, even if it's not with me. Tesfa tilted his head, those ancient eyes seeming to understand in ways that defied explanation. You deserve to be with your family, your real family. Not a family that feeds you the wrong food and keeps you in the wrong place and doesn't understand the sounds you make or the way you need to run. She pressed both palms against the gloss. You deserve mountains and sky and others like you. You deserve to be wild. The family joined her for several minutes, each taking their turn at the glass. Brian placed his engineer's hand there, speaking quietly about responsibility and difficult choices. Shirley touched the barrier with her teacher's gentleness, murmuring about love that sets free. Lizzie simply pressed her small forehead against the glass and whispered, "I'll miss you." Diana went last for the final goodbye. She stood, placed her hand one more time where Tesfa's paw met glass, and spoke words that marked the end of childhood in ways her parents recognized, even if she didn't yet fully understand. "Goodbye, Tesfa. Be happy, be wild, be free." "Letting go is sometimes the bravest thing we can do," Brian said, his arm around his daughter's shoulders. Shirley wiped her own tears. "We'll always have this story. We helped save something precious." "Will we ever see him again?" Lizzie asked Dr. Okonkwo. "I can arrange visits and updates, always," the biologist promised. "You're part of his story now. That connection doesn't end." They walked toward the exit in a tight cluster, supporting each other through grief that felt disproportionate to 1 week's time, but perfectly proportioned to the depth of love formed in crisis. Diana didn't look back, couldn't bear to see Tesfa watching them leave, but tears streamed down her face in acknowledgement of what was being lost and what, impossibly, was being gained. Behind them, through reinforced glass, one of the world's rarest creatures watched his rescuers disappear. He pawed once at the barrier, vocalized a sound that might have been goodbye, or might have been thank you, or might have been both. Then he turned toward the enclosure's far end, toward the artificial highlands that would prepare him for real ones, to a future that was finally, impossibly, the right one. Sometimes salvation looks like separation. Sometimes the truest act of love is the willingness to break your own heart so another's can beat wild and free where it belongs. The news broke on a gray November morning, 2 weeks after the Morrisons' goodbye at the conservation facility. Agent Torres stood before a bank of cameras and microphones, his federal credentials visible, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a job well done. Today, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, in cooperation with the FBI and local law enforcement, has dismantled an international wildlife trafficking ring responsible for smuggling endangered species across 3 states. His voice was measured, professional, but Diana, watching the live stream on her phone during lunch period, heard the triumph beneath it. 7 individuals have been arrested, including Daniel Kowalski, a staff member at Denver Zoo who used his access to steal animals from conservation programs. The screen filled with mugshots, Kowalski with his Zoo ID lanyard still visible, 4 men and women whose ordinary faces belied their extraordinary crimes, 2 wealthy collectors whose mansions had been raided at dawn. In addition to the Ethiopian wolf pup that initiated this investigation, Torres continued, we have recovered 2 snow leopards, 4 red pandas, 1 Amur tiger cub, and 3 additional Ethiopian wolf pups. The estimated black market value of these animals exceeds $2 million. Diana's classmates crowded around her phone, their voices rising with questions she couldn't yet answer. Her teacher, Miss Potterson, gave her permission to step into the hallway to watch the rest. This case was broken by the compassionate actions of a local family who rescued what they believed was an abandoned puppy, Torres said, and Diana's heart hammered. Their willingness to report unusual circumstances and cooperate fully with our investigation made all of this possible. Wildlife trafficking is a global crisis, but this case proves that individual action matters. That evening, Torres came to their home privately, away from cameras and official protocols. He shook Brian's hand, hugged Shirley, high-fived Lizzie, but when he turned to Diana, his expression shifted to something approaching respect. "Your compassion started all of this," he said simply. "Every animal we recovered, every arrest we made, it traces back to your family caring about a creature that needed help." Diana, who had grown quieter but somehow more present these past weeks, asked the question that had haunted her since the press conference. What happened to the other Ethiopian wolf pups? All surviving, Torres assured her. They've been reunited with Tesfa in the conservation program. Dr. Okonkwo is overseeing their care personally. Something shifted in Diana's posture then, a straightening that her parents recognized. That night, she stayed up past midnight researching wildlife conservation careers, filling a new notebook with questions she'd never thought to ask before. By week's end, she'd emailed Dr. Okonkwo asking about volunteer opportunities. Within a month, she was spending Saturday mornings at the local wildlife rehabilitation center, learning to prepare diets for injured raptors under careful supervision, discovering that her passion for animals could become purpose rather than just dreams. When a documentary crew contacted the family about featuring their story, Diana surprised everyone by negotiating conditions. "I'll do it," she told the producer, "but only if you focus on conservation, not just what happened to us. People need to understand why Ethiopian wolves matter, why all endangered species matter." The producer, a woman in her 40s who'd filmed countless human interest stories, smiled with visible approval. Deal. 3 months after they'd said goodbye, a letter arrived from Ethiopia, bearing official stamps and careful handwriting. Dr. Samuel Getachew, director of the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program, had written to inform them that Tesfa had completed his quarantine period and been successfully integrated into their captive breeding program in the Bale Mountains. Photographs spilled from the envelope. Tesfa, now fully grown and magnificent, standing among other Ethiopian wolves in habitat that finally matched his biology. Highland grasses stretched behind them. Mountains rose in the distance. Sky sprawled enormous in blue. He looked wild in ways he never could have in their suburban backyard, his posture confident, his place in the pack secure. Diana's tears came, but they were different this time. "He made it home," she whispered, tracing Tesfa's image with one finger. Pride, not grief. Joy, not loss. The family made a decision that night over dinner, unanimous and immediate. The documentary proceeds, when they came, would be donated to the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program. "It's his money anyway," Brian said, "his story that people want to hear." Diana's school presentation the following week drew a standing room-only crowd. Students, teachers, parents who'd heard about the Morrison family's experience. She stood before them with PowerPoint slides about Ethiopian wolves, about wildlife trafficking's devastating impact, about how individual choices ripple outward in ways we can't predict. "I thought love meant keeping something close," she concluded, her voice steady in ways it hadn't been months earlier. "But sometimes love means recognizing that what we want isn't what's needed. Tesfa taught me that. And now he's helping save his species, which matters more than my feelings ever could." The applause was thunderous, but Diana was already thinking ahead, to next steps, to how she could do more, be more useful to creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. Lizzie, inspired by her sister's transformation, started a junior wildlife rangers club at her elementary school. 8-year-olds made posters about endangered species, held bake sales for conservation organizations, learned that even children could contribute to something bigger than themselves. On a cold December evening, the Morrison family gathered around their computer to video call with Dr. Okonkwo. She turned her camera to show them the Oregon facility's newest addition, a state-of-the-art education center funded partially by donations generated by their story going viral. "You did this," Dr. Okonkwo said, her smile radiant. "Your family's choice to do the right thing, even when it hurt, has inspired thousands of people to care about conservation." Diana smiled back, and in that smile, her parents saw someone they were still getting to know, their daughter, transformed by loss into something stronger, someone who understood that heartbreak could be purposeful, that sacrifice could be sacred, that sometimes the smallest acts of compassion can save more than we ever imagined. 1 year after finding a starving creature in Riverside Park, the Morrison family stood before the gates of the Oregon Wildlife Conservation Center under autumn skies that mirrored the day their journey began. Diana was taller now, 13 years carrying themselves differently than 12, less certainty, more wisdom, the kind earned through heartbreak and growth. Dr. Okonkwo greeted them like old friends, which they'd become through countless video calls and emails. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, leading them through corridors Diana now recognized, past enclosures she'd studied in photographs. Dr. Patricia Cole waited in the observation center, her geneticist's mind evident in the way she spoke about Ethiopian wolves, not as animals, but as living repositories of irreplaceable biological information. Tesfa's genetic markers have proven crucial for species diversity, she explained, pulling up data that meant little to Brian's engineering mind, but everything to the program's success. He's already contributed to our breeding program. His offspring will eventually be candidates for reintroduction to the wild in Ethiopia. The viewing platform overlooked an expansive enclosure designed to mirror highland terrain. 6 Ethiopian wolves moved through the space with purpose and grace, and Diana's breath caught when she recognized him. Tesfa stood among them, no longer the emaciated creature wrapped in Lizzie's purple jacket, but magnificent in his maturity. His dark coat gleamed with health, his amber eyes alert, his posture confident in ways that spoke of belonging. One of the handlers called from the service entrance, "Tesfa." He turned immediately, ears forward, but didn't approach. His response was acknowledgement, not obedience, the difference between a trained pet and a wild animal that simply recognized its name. "He's not tame anymore," Diana observed, her voice carrying wonder rather than sadness. Dr. Cole smiled. "That's the goal. Wild hearts for wild places." "That's beautiful," Diana whispered. They watched Tesfa play with the other wolves, mock hunting, complex vocalizations, social behaviors that would have been impossible in a suburban backyard. Everything about him was fully expressed now, every instinct given room to flourish. He was what he was always meant to be. Brian's hand settled on his daughter's shoulder. "Any regrets?" Diana's tears came, but she was smiling. "Only that I couldn't see who he'd become sooner." She paused, watching Tesfa nuzzle another wolf in the pack. "But I understand now. He was never meant to be mine. He was always meant to be part of something bigger." The year had changed all of them. Diana volunteered every Saturday at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, her bedroom transformed into a shrine to conservation. Ethiopian wolf posters beside information about red pandas, snow leopards, every species threatened by human carelessness. Her college application essay, already drafted despite being years away, outlined plans for wildlife biology with the fierce determination of someone who'd found their purpose. Lizzie's junior wildlife rangers had grown to 45 members, their bake sales and car washes raising over $3,000 for endangered species programs. She wore her t-shirt everywhere, recruiting with 8-year-old enthusiasm that proved surprisingly effective. Brian and Shirley had become foster volunteers for the local animal rescue, their home a temporary haven for creatures in transition. They'd learned, alongside their daughter, that love sometimes means providing what's needed in the moment, then releasing when the time comes. That evening, back home, Diana sat at her desk with the journal she'd kept throughout the year. The Morrison family living room had become a gallery of their journey, young Tesfa wrapped in blanket beside recent photographs from Ethiopia showing him in wild landscape, a certificate from the Ethiopian Wolf Conservation Program honoring their contribution to species survival. She wrote slowly, choosing words with the care of someone who understood they mattered. "A year ago, we thought we were saving a puppy. Turns out, saving him changed us. He taught us that love isn't about holding on, it's about knowing when to let go." Tesfa means hope in Amharic. He gave us hope that doing the right thing matters, that one family can make a difference, that sometimes the greatest gift is freedom. She looked up at the photos on her wall, Tesfa silhouetted against Ethiopian highlands at sunset, free and wild and impossibly far from the park where their paths had crossed. He was home. And somehow, impossibly, so was she. Not the same home, but a better one, built from sacrifice and understanding and the recognition that love measured by what we're willing to release rather than what we're willing to keep. Outside her window, autumn stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that shone over Ethiopian highlands where fewer than 500 of the world's rarest wolves clung to existence. Every individual mattered. Every choice rippled outward. One family's compassion had saved not just a single creature, but contributed to saving an entire species, and in the process had saved themselves from the poverty of thinking small, of believing that holding tight was the only way to love. Diana closed her journal and turned off her light, but sleep was slow to come. She lay in darkness thinking about wild hearts and wild places, about 12-year-old certainty giving way to 13-year-old wisdom, about how sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones that matter most. Somewhere in Ethiopia, under different stars, Tesfa howled his evening song, free, alive, exactly where he belonged. And in a suburban bedroom, thousands of miles away, a girl who'd learned to measure love by sacrifice smiled in the darkness, understanding finally that they'd both come home, just not to the same place. Sometimes that's exactly how it's supposed to be. Fewer than 500 Ethiopian wolves remain in the wild. Every individual matters to the survival of the species. Wildlife trafficking threatens thousands of species worldwide. Report suspicious activity, support conservation efforts. Be the difference.